The way we lead impacts the way people live. This world needs truly human leadership. I'm Brent Stewart, your host. Thanks for listening. This podcast is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. You can connect with us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, and find our podcasts, articles, and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. You're listening to a Truly Human Leadership podcast refresher, where we reshare insight from podcast episodes from the past. Raj Sisodia is the co-founder and co-chairman of Conscious Capitalism. A professor at Babson College, he's written 7 books and published hundreds of academic articles. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Fortune, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, CNBC, and on many other media outlets. You're probably familiar with Raj's 2 most recent books, Firms of Endearment, How World-Class Companies Profit from Passion and Purpose, and Conscious Capitalism, Liberating the Heroic Spirit of Business, which he wrote with John Mackey, co-founder and co-CEO of Whole Foods. But we're hoping that very soon you'll be most familiar with Raj's upcoming book, Everybody Matters, The Extraordinary Power of Caring for Your People Like Family, co-written with Barry-Wehmiller's CEO, Bob Chapman. Everybody Matters is the story of Bob Chapman and Barry-Wehmiller's journey to people-centric leadership, and it'll be available October 6th. You can read the prologue and find out more at everybodymattersbook.com. On this week's podcast, we talked to Raj about the process of co-writing our book, but we also talk about Raj's personal journey, from marketing professor to conscious capitalist, to understanding how and why in business everybody should matter. Along the way, Raj shares much of the thoughtful insight he's written and spoken about. So now, here's a discussion between myself, Barry-Wehmiller's global messaging leader, Mary Rudder, and our good friend, Raj Sisodia. One of the things I wanted to start off by asking you is that there's obviously a theme in the books that you've worked on. You know, there's this theme about business and business in the world, business and people. How did that topic interest you? How did those become issues that were important to you?
Well, that's an interesting question because, and I've thought about it quite a bit. You know, I grew up as a kid with a lot of idealism in me and a lot of feeling around why can't people get along? Why can't everybody, be happy at the same time? Why does there have to be suffering and exploitation and all of these kinds of things? So I had that streak of idealistic thinking, which people tried to beat out of me, not beat physically, but they tried to disabuse me of that. Even my own father and my parents and others to say, you're too idealistic and the world doesn't work like that. And the world is a harsh and an unforgiving place. And so, I kind of suppressed that natural instinct. I would have wanted to become a journalist, but I wasn't able to do that at the time and became an engineer and did all kinds of other, business and so forth. But that instinct was inside me. And so even when I got into teaching business, there was some part of me that was always uncomfortable with the dominant narrative of business, which is that it is based upon using people in order to achieve your own goals, that it is a hyper-competitive dog-eat-dog world out there, and that only the paranoid can survive, and it's not personal, it's just business. And to be a boss, you really have to be kind of mean and aggressive and so forth. I mean, all of those ideas rubbed me the wrong way to a degree, but I felt that maybe that's the only way that people succeed. And it was only when I started discovering these companies through my work on Firms of Endearment, which arose out of my own frustration with marketing as it had been done or was being done for many decades, where companies spent huge amounts of money, and a lot of it on essentially misleading and trying to manipulate people, and ending up pushing things that weren't necessarily in the best interest of their customers. So even as they were doing all this and spending more and more money, customer loyalty and trust were declining because people felt used and abused by the process. And so a lot of my research for about 10 years was on that problem of marketing performance and productivity. And I made that case repeatedly with lots of data and research to show that it was getting worse and that marketing had a crisis and that it's neither efficient nor effective and it's unethical to boot to a large degree. So finally, I got some great advice. I was planning to write another book with that theme. I think I was calling it for a while The Shame of Marketing, which is a phrase that Peter Drucker had used once to describe the consumer movement in America. He said that's the shame of marketing. If marketers are doing their job, which is to look after the well-being of their customers, then why would customers have to organize themselves? So I was again making the case that things were bad, and then my mentor and co-author Jack Sheth gave me some great advice. He said, people want to hear about the solution and not the problem. And so with that lens, I turned it around and I started to then look for companies that spent less money and yet had outstanding customer loyalty and trust. And that's how we started to discover the conscious companies. And we found that these companies were not only trusted and people had loyalty for them, that people actually love these companies as customers. But beyond that, their employees loved them as well. And the whole stakeholder orientation. And then we discovered the purpose and the cultures we discovered were built upon a lot of trust and responsibility and authenticity and caring. So these are businesses built on love and care. And then at the end of that research, when we did the financial analysis, we found that these companies actually succeed at a higher level. Right? So then it became, wow, that it's possible to be a business like this and be actually more successful than the traditional approach to business, which is all about squeezing and using and manipulating. And that, I think, spoke to something deep in me, which was this, as I said, this innate idealism and positive view of people. And to say that you can be that way and be successful is not a choice, that you don't have to forsake this kind of success in order to be operating in that way. So I think that's what really resonated with me at some deep fundamental level. And it was kind of an affirmation that my worldview wasn't perhaps so impractical or distorted, after all, and that this was the way. And when I did that and I started writing about it in a more explicit way, I discovered that there are many, many people who have felt those things and who have felt a little bit uncomfortable with the way in which we think and talk and act about business. And I think that's what's really, there's a deep hunger out there for this message. And so that's then carried through in my work subsequent to that with Conscious Capitalism, with this book, as well as with other projects that I'm involved in now. It's essentially all around what I think Kim Cameron at the University of Michigan talks about virtuous business, the businesses that are done fundamentally with human values at the core. Actually, it's not only the right thing to do, but it also leads to greater success.
Why do you think you were so idealistic? I mean, what's the difference there?
It is an interesting question. I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, if I had to look at my parents, I think I'm more like my mom than my dad. But beyond that, I think part of it also may be, so I was kind of a sensitive kid and, more like my mom, etc. And my dad is very different. He's much more of a patriarch type figure. And I come from a subculture within India, which is perhaps the most patriarchal, the most feudal almost. These are descendants of the former rulers of, India had like 550 so-called kingdoms at one time. And, there was a whole feudal tradition around that. And so I come from a sect that really came out of that and that were given these various, pieces of land and essentially ruled over them and so forth. And so it's a extremely male-dominated, patriarchal, feudal, I would say in many ways, exploitative and unhealthy subculture. And I grew up initially in that, but then we left India for 5 years. From the age of 7 to 12, we lived in various other places in the West Indies, Barbados, and California and Canada. And then went back when I was 12. And I was able to look at all that with a different set of eyes and almost be repelled by some of it, and say, wow, this is not right, And I could see things that my cousins and my uncles and others could not. And so maybe that created a certain sensitivity around, the way that they were treating people, for example, the way they were treating people who worked for them. It was terrible actually. And I could see the anger and the hatred in the eyes of those people. And yet they were helpless to do something about it. But sometimes they would lash out, and I saw those experiences too, where my uncle got attacked by somebody once, So, I mean, I think it's hard to know, but I just grew up in that environment of knowing that this way of being is not the right way, and it's not good. It's not the right way to treat people and so forth. And I was a bit of a lone voice in that, because everybody else kind of just celebrated all that stuff and reveled in it. And I never did. So that's the closest I can come to think about why that is, But otherwise, I think to a degree we are all born in a certain way, and we have to try to figure that out and try to be true to it. But I think it can also change. We have the possibility of growing and evolving as well.
So did Conscious Capitalism, the whole movement, arise out of your book with John Mackey, or was it in existence prior to that?
No, it was in existence prior to that. The book came out in 2013. We started the nonprofit in 2008. And my book, Firms of Endearment, came out in 2007, in which we featured Whole Foods and many other companies, but Whole Foods was pretty prominent in that. And through that, I met John Mackey. And when I met him, and he loved the book, and he said, this is exactly what I believe in, and I want to promote this message about business. And when I first met him, I had a mind map in my pocket, which I was carrying around. It was called the Institute for New Capitalism. It was my vision for trying to create a movement around a different way of thinking about business based on what we had uncovered in that research. And he looked at that and he said, oh, this is exactly what I believe in and what I want to do, but I call it conscious capitalism. And so this was when he and I first met in 2007. And so we decided then to come together and have a meeting at his ranch a few months later, where we'd invited a bunch of people to explore the idea of trying to launch something in this area. So that's how we started in 2008 with the Conscious Capitalism movement, and then formalized it into a nonprofit a year or so later. But we did our first big event in 2008. So that's really, I would say, when we really started the movement. And then after a few years of that, we realized that it would really be helpful to have a book that encapsulates all of this. And in a way, Firms of Endearment already had those 4 pillars in it. It had stakeholders, it had purpose, it had leadership and culture, but it wasn't as explicitly set out as a framework. And that's what we did in Conscious Capitalism. And also having a CEO as a co-author, gave it a very practical bent.
How did you uncover these companies?
Well, the initial lens was a very simple one, right? We just wanted companies that spent less than the industry average on marketing and had much higher levels of customer loyalty and trust. Now, some of that data is available for public companies. They do have to reveal in their annual reports how much they spend on advertising and other forms of marketing. So that's how we originally discovered. And then once we had some initial sense that this company might fit, then we did some case studies on these companies and looked at them in more detail and looked at the whole picture, beyond customers. Right? So we found what are the other common patterns to these companies as well. So that's how I would say we started with that question. We found a bunch of companies like that. Then we started doing detailed case studies, and we discovered that these companies were actually loved, not only liked, but loved by all their stakeholders. So then in order to broaden the pool of companies, I was doing a study at the time, I think, on the image of marketing. Or maybe it came a little later, I forget the sequence now. But at some point we did a survey asking people to name companies that they love. And we had about 400 names of companies. And then we started screening those down based on some criteria. And then I ultimately had 60 companies that we did case studies on and picked 28 of them finally for the book. And that's how that evolved. And then as we were writing the book and we had lots and lots of stories from these various companies, it was a deeply emotional experience just writing that book. I remember my co-author David Wolf and I in writing retreats in Pennsylvania and in New Hampshire. I mean, we would get deeply moved and very emotional just writing about some of the things that were going on in these kinds of businesses. So that's when it really spoke to me at a deep level that, wow, there's deep humanity inside many businesses that just doesn't get acknowledged or talked about.
With Firms of Endearment, it sounds like you, I don't want to disrespect your work and say did a cursory look at these businesses, but it certainly wasn't the same viewpoint that you would have in co-writing Conscious Capitalism with John Mackey, because you, like you said before, you were right there with the founder, the practitioner,
Right.
the person who had been in the middle of that. What was that experience like, and how did it kind of maybe advance your journey in terms of your thinking about these companies and business leadership?
Yeah, I think so. Firms of endearment was a look across a large set of companies, and therefore the amount of depth that we went into on each company was a little bit less. Conscious Capitalism, of course, had a lot more depth on this one company, but also we did talk about some other companies in there too. But certainly it did provide a lot of detail into what makes Whole Foods what it is. And I think the process of writing that book for me, as is every project, is a learning journey. And John Mackey is a very thoughtful and extremely well-read in a wide variety of areas. And in that process of spending a lot of time with him in multiple writing retreats and going for long walks and so forth, we talked about all kinds of subjects. And I think I learned more about business in that process probably than what I learned in my PhD in business in many ways, because that tends to be very theoretical and based on academic writing to a large extent. And I also, through that whole process, and not just in writing the book, but working with John before that in the Conscious Capitalism movement, also developed a deeper appreciation for capitalism and business generally. I think there's this tendency to think about business as kind of this necessary evil, and we just have to figure out how to harness it and get its benefits and not allow it to take us over and so forth. I think that mindset exists even in business schools. And with John and through working with John, I came to really appreciate the tremendous power and beauty of business and appreciate the impact that it has had on human lives. Compared to where we have been throughout human history, the last 2 centuries where we really have had business and capitalism as major forces have seen huge amounts of progress, not only in economic terms, but other terms as well. So, recognizing business as a tremendous force for good in the world, I think that's an appreciation that I got much more by working with John, and had a much more nuanced view of what business is about and what still, it has done a lot, but it can do even more when we realize this higher level of consciousness in thinking about it.
And then the story goes that we discovered the book Conscious Capitalism here at Barry-Wehmiller and decided that we wanted to get a group together to read it. And we did like a book study on it, and realized that, you were also sort of talking about us. I was like, wow, this is us. This is a lot of who we are.
Right.
And we loved the book. And that's where it all started, where we started collaborating with you on our book. So from your perspective, why don't you tell us how it all came to be?
Yeah, so I think, I'm not sure what the sequence was, but I know that Shri Kumar Rao had visited, and the idea of, I think he may have planted the seed that there should be a book on this. And I think Bob asked him for suggestions, and he gave my name. And then Bob and I did have a conversation around that time. So I'm not sure if by that time you all had done the book study. I think maybe not. Maybe Conscious Capitalism was not even done by that time, or maybe it had just come out.
No, I think that's right. We had spent some time with Sri Kumar and loved his demeanor, loved what he had to say, and he was the one who originally had said, you would be selfish if you guys didn't share this. You need to start talking about this in a bigger way. And for years there had been talk of a book. He planted the seed.
Right.
And then I understand that Bob, after we read Conscious Capitalism, approached you.
Yes. So then we set up a call and we talked, and I may have looked at a video or so. And then my initial reaction, because by then the Conscious Capitalism was done and I was involved in other projects, My initial reaction was, well, that's great. I mean, this is a great company, nice company, and there are lots of great companies out there. And I didn't necessarily see at the time the reason to spend a year or two working on just one company. So I said, well, okay, this is yet another example of what we're talking about, but how does this advance the message? How do we learn something new from this? And initially I didn't know. And my question was that my presumption was that there wasn't a lot to learn. But of course, Bob was persistent as he is and very persuasive. And basically all he said was just come and take a look and then decide. And so I think that happened a few months later, July of that year, that I was finally able to come out and do the tour and visit the Green Bay and Phillips and come and end up in St. Louis. And that process, and Rhonda and Brian and Sarah, all of them were along on the plane, and they made a presentation on the plane before we even got to the first location. And so that immersion in those over those 2 days really gave me a good feel for what was going on, and also to compare it to what I already knew or had learned through my earlier work. And I concluded at the end of those 2 days, and I probably said it in the video that you all took at that time, which is that there were 2 ways in which I saw this advancing the message of conscious capitalism, or deepening it or enriching it further. One was in the realm of purpose, where we had predominantly thought about purpose in terms of the product or service that you produce and what impact that has on customers' lives. And what I discovered here is that it's possible to have a purpose that's purely rooted in your people. That can be your predominant purpose, and your products become almost secondary to that. And that was an important aha for me, because one of the pushbacks you get on conscious capitalism is many people saying, well, we operate in these mundane product categories. We really can't get our people very excited about the product itself. And so how do we achieve higher purpose in our business if we don't have that through our product? We're not all Googles or Whole Foods. And so this, to me, had the potential of universalizing the reach of these ideas of conscious capitalism, to say that every business in the world has people at its core. And if you can make people an essential element of purpose, and the product purpose may also be there, it's great to have both. But if you could only have one, then this becomes the one you must have. So I think that was an important insight for me. And the second one was around leadership, where we had talked about conscious leadership, but we had mostly thought of it in terms of the impact you have on how people feel at work and what happens during the workday. And we had never thought about it beyond that, to say that the way we lead impacts the way people live, and that it has an impact on their families, their children, and beyond. And so that whole notion of thinking about leadership as the stewardship of those lives and recognizing the ripple effect, to me, was also very, very powerful, because it just raised the stakes to an even higher level as to what it means to be a leader and what are the consequences of good or bad leadership. So that was more than enough for me to say, yes, this book needs to be written, and I would be honored to be part of that journey. So that's how we started.
Do you have any specific memories or about people that you talked to, or that you met, that you saw?
Yeah, quite a few. I mean, it was a very moving experience. I remember meeting a gentleman at the first location. I think we first may have gone to Phillips or Wisconsin, Green Bay perhaps. But I remember him talking about he had a fire in his apartment or his home where he lived, and lost everything. And then how all his colleagues had surprised him later on, and basically bought him all this furniture and helped him set up a new place and so forth. I mean, there was just, and he started crying while he was relating that story. And that kind of became a theme for those 2 days, where I would sit with groups of people and I would essentially ask them a simple question: tell me how it was before Barry-Wehmiller acquired this business and how it changed. And even before they could get a lot of details out, people started getting choked up in many cases. And these are, as you know, middle-aged blue-collar men for the most part. And so that was a bit of a revelation, to say, wow, there's a huge amount of emotion here and feeling. and people have such deep sentiments about this. So then, as I said, a number of those experiences over those 2 days showed me the authentic power of this, and then learning about some of those people subsequently as well. I think I also got to experience one of the SSR award ceremonies, and that was a great deal of fun, to be out there among those 200-300 people. And then I think all the people who had been nominated were called out by name one by one, and there's a huge crowd of them. And then the winners, the husband wife, both won it simultaneously together, and then their family popping out from behind the tree or wherever they were hiding. It was just a very fun and again very emotional experience. So here was a company where emotions were not suppressed. Their emotions were very close to the surface and were being, not only allowed to express, but people are really, embodying all of these things. So I think that was really eye-opening as well.
What's your hope for the book when it comes out?
My hope is that this book will open people's eyes and hearts to the fact that sometimes we lose sight of what's essential, and recognizing that business is ultimately about people. I use this thing in my presentations where I talk about, well, business is not a math problem, like the economists and some finance people have made it into. And business is not a machine, like some people tend to think about it, as a mechanistic kind of thing. And it's not a game. Some people have that detached perspective on it. They're just placing bets. And some people treat it like war. It's really about a different form of combat, and you have to destroy, your competitors, and even to some degree you have to squeeze your suppliers and everybody in order to win. There's only can be one winner. So I think this notion that business is about the real lives of real people, and that the way we lead impacts the way people live, and that I think is a very important message for leaders in any realm to understand. I mean, they know it at some level, but they've lost sight of it because we get caught up in the day-to-day tactical elements of business, the strategic elements and so forth. And we can take the people for granted. And I think that's, to me, the biggest wake-up call for anybody really who picks up this book, to say, never lose sight of the fact that it's ultimately all about the people. As Herb Kelleher says, the business of business is people. It's nothing else. It's not money and it's not anything. It's ultimately it's people, and everything else, comes after that and is in service of that. So that's my hope, that anybody who has any kind of leadership responsibility at any level in any kind of organization would look at this and be reminded of what is the essence of, or the purpose of why they're doing what they're doing. And also, I think people who innately value people orientation themselves, but have been told that they need to be tougher and they need to be, harsher, and they need to be more detached and so forth, that they can also take comfort from this, that in fact, this is the way to be in order to be more successful. So, you get a message out there that you cannot truly care about people and be successful at the same time. And I think that's a very, very important belief that we have to challenge, the mental model that people have, because that's what leads to all kinds of toxic behaviors. People feel that they need to succeed, and the only way to do that is by trampling on others. And I think that's at the root, as Bob says, this is how we have to heal our civilization, by changing the way in every organization we think about and relate to people. So that's my hope. I think the book has enormous potential in that sense, partly because of its context. It is the heartland. It is a traditional industry, old manufacturing. It is not what some would think cutting edge business context. And a lot of those still remain, but they have been forgotten, and people have kind of given up on those aspects, And so the fact that it can work in those very challenging geographies and in those very challenged industries shows that there's hope for this in any situation.
So a recent college grad meets you, realizes what you do and your experience, and she says, how should I look for work? What should I do given the experience you have and what you've learned?
Yeah, and I do get that a fair amount, of course, doing what I do. So if they're looking for a job, then I tell them, of course, to look at any prospective companies through this lens, to make sure that they're part of something that is doing meaningful work in the world, has a culture that cares about people, and is personally relevant to them. Right? In other words, it should be ideally something that resonates with what they are all about. So helping them and urging them to really discover their own essence, what makes them tick, and what their own personal purpose is in life. I mean, a lot of my course on conscious capitalism is about that personal growth and development, and learning about yourself and understanding what it is that you were born to do, essentially, or trying to figure that out, and then making sure that the work that you do is in harmony with that. And that includes, of course, encouraging them to start their own business. And especially because I'm at Babson now, which is all about entrepreneurship, a lot of kids already have that orientation. But I try to push them on whether or not it's something they're doing just to make money, or whether it's something that they deeply, passionately care about. Right? It might be just a clever idea that they had, that they think there's an opportunity out there, and that's okay. But ultimately, it won't amount to anything significant unless there's a deep passion there. So getting them to ask those questions. And the third one, I find that a lot of kids, especially when I was at Bentley earlier, but even now, a lot of young people, and actually I do speak to groups of high school students as well, who come to various camps and so forth, and I'm asked to speak to them about this. And I find that the most idealistic young people tend to not want to have anything to do with business. That they all want to, these are some of the most highly accomplished kids that get selected for these things. But all of them have an idea to start a nonprofit, and they want to address serious challenges and problems. But they usually think of doing it only in the context of a nonprofit, because to them that is noble and good. And whereas doing it as a business would be somehow cheap and, selfish. And I try to change their mindset on that. I say, it would be even better if you could do this as a for-profit. And here's why. Okay? Because you would not be reliant on subsidies and on donations, and you could actually scale this and make it a much more sustainable enterprise if you can figure out a business model around it. And you'll be doing more good for more people that way. So I think that mindset also is something that I encourage people to explore, because that's not what most people have. That's the mental image. They've got this wall between the virtuous nonprofit and sort of the greedy, selfish business, and they don't want anything to do with the greedy, selfish business. And I think the young people, especially the millennial generation, very much has that mindset. So I think trying to change some of that and recognize that business is a force for good, provided it's done with the right consciousness.
Don't forget to find us and connect on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller. And you can find more podcasts, articles, and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stewart. Thanks for listening.